Amy. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was a little bit lost when I was invited as to exactly what I should talk about, because crisis and distribution, obvious topics, but in some ways, looking at just the crisis and what happens perhaps to distribution as or if we get out of the crisis seemed perhaps less interesting than the longer-term trends. So what I will be doing is talking about a couple of issues that draw upon several papers that I've been working on over the last couple of years, because it does draw on a number of papers. It will be rather sketchy, but I hope the main argument will be clear. Profit shares, first, just to get some stylized facts here. If you look at profit shares, in fact, there isn't that much action in that picture here. They fell, if you look at the long-term trend, and then there's a slight increase, but it's not as dramatic as you might think when we all know that inequality has gone up. So in some ways, looking just at the functional distribution of income and the aggregate picture, I think misses some important aspects. One can quibble about exactly how is this calculated. There is the question of executive pay and including that, and that may add a couple of percentage points. Then you could ask, should we include the financial sector, and if you don't include that, that drops down a little bit again. But I think the main point is that if you look at the profit share, it doesn't tell the full picture. There has been, however, a great increase in earnings inequality. There was a great compression in the 1940s, and then, in particular, since the 1970s, there has been a drastic increase in inequality. Now, what is the standard explanation for that? And if you look at most of the literature, people would say, hey, skill bias technical change is the main candidate. There's also been some emphasis also in kind of mainstream literature on institutional changes, but those changes sort of come up against two possible questions. One is that explanation consistent with the picture that we see, not just for wage inequality, but also for the employment pattern? And then the other question is, can we treat it as exogenous?
Excuse me, if you're not going to use the mic, can you turn it off? We're getting a ringing.
Oh, I was told it had to be here because of the recording. I would prefer not to use it. Sure. What can I do? Can I?
No, we
Use it. Okay. Just to indicate the problem here, if you look at the wage inequality, and that is the circles here, you have rising inequality here. It's like the skilled, non-skilled, or low-skilled wage inequality. And then you have, at the same time, this drastic increase in the share of skilled workers. So you have skilled workers becoming more expensive and firms employing them. And that's what people have said, okay, that's an indication we must have had skill bias technical change. Now, I want to propose a couple of alternatives, because I think it's important that we think about the background to this. If it is important for what's going on, and I'll get back to some of the macro implications of this later, then it's important also to be clear about why perhaps the skill bias story is wrong. What I'm going to suggest is that there may be, if we want to look at technical change, there may be a power bias instead, and that's sort of a Marxian element, if you want, that has been much more important. And I would also suggest that perhaps, if this is correct, then that power bias may be at least partly related to some of the institutional changes that occurred both during the big compression back in the 40s, but also some of the changes that have occurred later. The other element I want to draw on is a story about mismatch. And that is primarily here because if you have the institutional changes and you want to explain the paradox of, okay, institutional change may have led to a drop in the wage of low-skilled workers and an increase in high-skilled wages and other earnings, why do we see the employment pattern? And that is what this may help to explain. And that also has implications for whether, if we pursue institutional changes that reverse some of this widening inequality, would we then expect adverse consequences for employment? And the answer, I'll suggest, is no, we wouldn't, because of this mismatch that may help explain the pattern. So those are the two different strands, and I hope to at least tell you a little bit about the main ideas behind it. Look first at this power bias technical change. Perhaps the best way to say briefly is to give you this, if you can read it. This is from my local paper. I saw that a couple of years ago when I was writing this paper. And it's an ad for this Fleet black box. What this Fleet black box does is it enables the owner of a truck to keep track of exactly what the truck is doing at any second. It can provide, as it says in this, it's tamper-proof and offers second-by-second reporting of vehicle speed, G-force, throttle position, and even interior sound level. Why is that interesting? It's interesting because in former times, if a truck driver went from Boston to LA, he left, she left, and then after that, it was very hard for the employer to keep track of exactly what happened. Might get there late and he would say, oh, there was heavy traffic, right? There's no way to monitor continuously what's going on. Some of the technical change we've seen has enabled employers, firms, to monitor their employers much, much more closely. What does that mean? Well, essentially it means that the power that employees have has been eroded, the power of employers have been increased. It's not just truck drivers, that's a very good example, but think of supermarkets, of people manning the registers there. This is from Business Week a couple of years ago, where you have this nice picture, and with all the new technology, you now have software analysis, software analyzes cashier transactions for signs of fraud. You can now monitor the productivity of your cashiers very closely. You can make sure they don't give sweet deals to customers they like. Why is that important? Well, if you think again, power, it's an erosion of the power of the worker and an increased ability of the employer to monitor what's going on. Think call centers, think a whole range of occupation where these things have happened. So worker power has been eroded. Firms are able to monitor exactly what workers do. They can monitor the state in which workers operate. Is there heavy traffic or not? They can manage information flows in ways they couldn't do before. One can try to formalize this and model this, and the obvious way to do that is some kind of efficiency wage model, which precisely speaks to this. Firms are not able to monitor fully what is happening. So one can model it formally, one can include this increase in worker power in this setting, and one can find that in fact this generates the possibility that power bias technical change will lead to a worsening of both wage and employment outcomes for low-skilled workers. You can also find as a prediction that it will lead to a rise in work intensity, which is something that a lot of studies have suggested. And of course it has a fairly obvious implication that all of a sudden technical change is no longer necessarily welfare enhancing. It's not even, it may not always be, but there's a presumption that you could compensate so that in principle you could get Pareto improvements. This is no longer the case because power bias technical change may be introduced even if there's no overall efficiency gain. It's a way of changing the distribution